Your investment portfolio is probably built on incomplete historical data, just like cartography was in 1513. That year, Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis drew a map revealing coastlines Europeans wouldn't officially discover for 300 years. When Constantinople's librarian found that parchment in 1929, one section contradicted the entire exploration timeline. But here's what this 500-year-old mystery reveals about hidden information that could reshape your financial decisions. Has ever adequately explained where he got it? The real question isn't whether the map is accurate. It's how Piri Reis saw what shouldn't have been visible to anyone alive in his time. It's 1929. A librarian in Constantinople is cataloguing the contents of the Topkapi Palace, a routine task, decades overdue. Somewhere in the middle of a stack of disused Ottoman documents, he pulls out a gazelle skin parchment. It's folded, brittle at the edges. Drawn in 1513 by an admiral named Piri Reis. And when they unroll it fully and hold it under the light, one section of that map should not exist. Not for another 300 years. That's the question that's never been satisfactorily answered. What did Piri Reis see? And where did he get it? The map itself, Hafiz Ahmed Muhyiddin Piri, known to history simply as Piri Reis, was no amateur. He was an Ottoman admiral, a naval commander of considerable reputation, and a serious student of cartography at a time when accurate maps were military weapons. He completed this particular world map in 1513, just 21 years after Columbus made his first crossing. The map survives today as a fragment, roughly a third of the original. What remains shows the Atlantic Ocean, the western coastlines of Europe and Africa, and the eastern coastline of South America with a precision that, for 1513, is genuinely remarkable. Columbus's voyages were barely documented. Accurate longitude measurement was still 2 centuries away. And yet the proportions are close. Uncomfortably close. But the western coastline of South America isn't what stopped researchers cold in 1929. It was the bottom of the map. Below the South American landmass, running along what should be empty ocean, there is a continuous coastline. Detailed. Specific. Annotated in Piri Reis's own hand with notes about the terrain. Cold, he wrote. Barren. Covered in ice. In 1513, no European navigator had gone anywhere near that latitude. Antarctica wasn't officially sighted until 1820, by Russian, British, and American expeditions moving into genuinely uncharted waters. And the full shape of the Antarctic coastline, what lies beneath the ice, wasn't mapped until seismic surveys were conducted in the mid-20th century. That's where this stops being an interesting historical footnote. The Ohlmeyer letter in what I found in the archives, few documents are as quietly extraordinary as a single letter written on July 6, 1960. The recipient was a historian named Charles Hapgood, who had been studying the Piri Reis map for years and had written to the United States Air Force for a technical assessment. The reply came from Harold Z. Ohlmeyer, a lieutenant colonel and cartographic officer at the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron. Ohlmeyer's assessment was precise and professional. He wrote that the southern coastline on the Piri Reis map, the one drawn in 1513, appeared to match the subglacial topography of Antarctica as revealed by the seismic survey data compiled during the International Geophysical Year of 1958. Not the ice surface star. The land beneath it. The coastline that had been buried under a mile of ice for thousands of years. He noted, carefully, that his unit had no explanation for how this information could have appeared on a map drawn 4.5 centuries earlier. That letter was filed. It didn't circulate widely. And the mainstream historical community, when they eventually engaged with it, did what institutions often do with uncomfortable data: they looked for reasons to dismiss it. The dismissals came in 3 main forms. First, Piri Reis was mapping a theoretical landmass. Medieval cartographers sometimes drew speculative southern continents, terra australis incognita, as a kind of philosophical counterweight to the northern landmass. The map, critics argued, was simply continuing that tradition. Second, the coastline is distorted, and what looks like Antarctica might be a misshapen rendering of the southern tip of South America. Third, Hapgood was a crank, and engaging with his thesis seriously would only legitimize fringe history. All three arguments have problems. The theoretical landmass explanation collapses when you look at the annotations. Piri Reis didn't describe a philosophical construct. He described specific terrain. Cold. Barren. Covered in ice. That's not a philosophical counterweight, that's field observation. Or something derived from field observation. The distortion argument is more interesting, but it requires you to ignore the matching topology. Ohlmeyer's team wasn't doing impressionistic comparison. They were overlaying the seismic survey data, hard numbers, specific elevations, and contours, against what Piri Reis drew. The matches were too specific to be coincidental bends in a coastline. And the third argument, attacking the researcher rather than the data, is not, technically, a counter-argument at all. Here's what Piri Reis himself actually said about his sources. This is the part that gets overlooked. On the map itself, in his own handwriting, Piri Reis left marginal notes explaining his methodology. He stated that he compiled the map from approximately 20 source charts. Some were contemporary, Portuguese navigation maps, Spanish expedition records. But others, he wrote, dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. One source, he claimed, was a map that had been on board one of Columbus's ships, a pre-existing chart that Columbus himself was working from, not creating from scratch. Think carefully about what that implies. Columbus, according to Piri Reis, wasn't sailing blind into the unknown. He was following a map. A map that already showed where he was going. A map that Piri Reis then folded into his own compilation, alongside charts ancient enough that their origin was, even in 1513, already lost to time. This is not a fringe claim. It is written on the artifact itself. And it reframes everything, because if accurate pre-Columbian charts of the Atlantic and southern landmasses existed and were circulating in the late 15th century, the question is no longer how did Piri Reis know? The question becomes how far back does that knowledge actually go? Let that sit for a moment, because we're about to go somewhere the standard academic treatment doesn't. The International Geophysical Year seismic surveys that Ohlmeyer referenced were conducted between 1957 and 1958. They involved 67 nations, thousands of researchers, and represented the most comprehensive mapping of Antarctica's subglacial topography ever attempted at that point. Their findings were published and cross-referenced against every known map of Antarctic coastlines. The Piri Reis map matched specific contours that no surface observation could have produced, because those contours were under ice. Ice that, based on core sample dating, had been accumulating for somewhere between 6,000 and 9,000 years at the time of the surveys. That's the number that matters. 6,000 years minimum. Possibly 9,000. Which means, if the map is genuinely depicting subglacial coastline rather than a convenient coincidence, the source data Piri Reis compiled from was created before that ice existed. Before it accumulated. When whatever civilization or navigational culture drew those original charts could walk that coastline and observe it directly. This is where serious researchers either lean in or step back. Because what you're looking at, if you follow the evidence without flinching, is the possibility that sophisticated cartographic knowledge was produced by a culture operating somewhere between 4000 BCE and 7000 BCE, preserved across thousands of years of transmission, and was still intact enough in the 15th century CE that Columbus had a copy on his ship. Now apply the framework. In 1513, the prevailing model of the world had a hard southern boundary. Everything below a certain latitude was theoretical. The maps reflected the consensus. The consensus was wrong, not because the information didn't exist, but because the information wasn't circulating in the channels that cartographers trusted. It was sitting in archives, in libraries, in private collections. in the hands of navigators who didn't publish. The people building their understanding of the world from official channels, from the maps that institutions endorsed and universities taught, were working from incomplete data. Not because they were foolish. Because the complete data wasn't visible to them. The Ohlmeyer letter sat in a file. The marginal notes on the Piri Reis map went untranslated in major academic discussions for decades. The seismic survey correlation was noted once, professionally, by a credentialed military cartographic officer, and then quietly set aside because it didn't fit the established timeline. That is not a conspiracy. That is how institutions behave when the data contradicts the model they've already built their credibility on. They find reasons. And the people relying on those institutions keep making decisions based on the official map, the one that ends where the consensus ends. Piri Reis had 20 sources. Most people had one. The difference between his map and everyone else's wasn't intelligence or access to magic, it was the number of inputs he refused to discard because they seemed implausible. He took the ancient chart seriously. He cross-referenced. He included the data that didn't fit the mainstream picture of his era. The subglacial coastline on that gazelle-skin parchment represents information that predates recorded civilization by at least 6,000 years, and the only reason it almost disappeared from history entirely is that the people who could have acted on it were reading the wrong map. Don't be one of them.